value the clear distinction made between God's dealings with Israel and the church. Reason. This distinction helps. The relationship between Christian theology and Zionism is complex and multifaceted, influenced by historical, theological, and political factors. Here are some key points to understand this relationship. 1. Historical context. Christian Zionism. This movement emerged in the 19th century among Protestant Christians who believed that the return of Jews to the Holy Land and the establishment of the State of Israel were in accordance with biblical prophecy. This belief is often based on a literal interpretation of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament prophecies. Political support. Some Christians have supported the modern state of Israel for theological reasons, seeing it as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a precursor to the second coming of Christ. Number 2, theological perspectives. Biblical prophecy. Christian Zionists often refer to prophecies in the Bible, such as those found in the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which they interpret as predicting the return of Jews to their ancestral homeland. Dispensationalism. This theological framework, particularly popular among evangelical Christians, divides history into distinct periods or dispensations. It often includes a belief that the modern state of Israel plays a crucial role in the end times prophecy. 3. Support and criticism. Support. Many Christian Zionists actively support the state of Israel through political lobbying, financial contributions, and solidarity trips. They see the establishment of Israel as a positive development in God's plan for humanity. Criticism. Other Christians, including some mainstream Protestant and Catholic groups, criticize Christian Zionism for its potential to foster political instability, neglect the rights of Palestinians, and misinterpret biblical texts. They argue for a more nuanced and justice-oriented approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 4. Interfaith relations. The relationship between Christian Zionism and Jewish communities can be both cooperative and contentious. While some Jews appreciate the political support from Christian Zionists, others are wary of theological motivations that might include a proselytizing agenda or a focus on apocalyptic outcomes. 5. Political implications. Christian Zionism has influenced U.S. foreign policy, particularly through the support of pro-Israel policies among evangelical Christians. This has shaped the political landscape in the Middle East and the broader international community. Understanding the relationship between Christian theology and Zionism requires recognizing the diversity of beliefs and motivations within Christianity, as well as the broader historical and political contexts in which these views have developed.
Dispensationalism. I want you to explain. Oh, I thought you were going to keep going, but alas, I have to go and do it myself. I have to go down in this...
Dispensationalism is a theological framework within Christian eschatology that divides history into distinct periods, or dispensations, in which God interacts with humanity in different ways. It is particularly popular among evangelical Christians and has significantly influenced their views on biblical prophecy and the end times. Here are the key features of dispensationalism. 1. 7 dispensations. Classical dispensationalism typically outlines 7 distinct periods in biblical history. Innocence, before the fall of Adam and Eve. Conscience, from the fall to the flood. Human government, from Noah to Abraham. Promise, from Abraham to Moses. Law, from Moses to Christ. Grace, from Christ to the rapture. Millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ after his second coming. 2. Literal interpretation of the Bible. Dispensationalists emphasize a literal interpretation of biblical prophecy. This approach often leads to specific predictions about future events, including the return of the Jews to Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, and the Battle of Armageddon. 3. Israel and the Church. Dispensationalism maintains a clear distinction between Israel and the Church. It teaches that God's promises to Israel in the Old Testament are distinct and separate from his promises to the Church in the New Testament. This distinction is crucial to understanding dispensationalist views on prophecy and the end times. 4. The rapture. One of the most well-known aspects of dispensationalism is the belief in the rapture, an event in which Christians are taken up to heaven before a period of tribulation on earth. This is followed by Christ's second coming and the establishment of his millennial kingdom. 5. End times prophecy. Dispensationalists believe that we are currently living in the grace dispensation and that the end times will involve a series of prophetic events, including the rapture, a 7-year tribulation period, the rise of the Antichrist, the Battle of Armageddon, Christ's return, and his millennial reign. 6. Influence on Christian Zionism. Dispensationalism has been a significant influence on Christian Zionism. Many dispensationalists support the modern state of Israel, believing it to be a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a necessary precursor to the end times. 7. Prominent figures. Some of the key figures in the development and popularization of dispensationalism include John Nelson Darby, who is often considered the father of modern dispensationalism, and Cyrus Scofield, whose Scofield Reference Bible helped spread dispensationalist ideas. 8. Criticism. Dispensationalism has been criticized by other Christian theologians and denominations for its rigid literalism, its separation of Israel and the Church, and its potential for fostering political agendas, particularly regarding the Middle East. Critics argue for a more allegorical or covenantal interpretation of the Bible. Overall, dispensationalism provides a framework for understanding the Bible and history through a series of divine interactions with humanity, emphasizing literal prophecy and a clear distinction between God's plans for Israel and the Church.
Oh, gollies. Gollies. Where is it? Oh, no.
Several key figures have been instrumental in developing and popularizing dispensationalism. Here are some of the most prominent. 1. John Nelson Darby, 1800 to 1882, often considered the father of modern dispensationalism, an Anglican priest who later joined the Plymouth Brethren, developed the idea of dispensations and the pre-tribulation rapture. His teachings and writings laid the foundation for dispensationalist theology. 2. Cyrus Ingerson Scofield, 1843 to 1921, an American theologian and minister, best known for the Scofield Reference Bible, published in 1909. The Scofield Reference Bible included extensive annotations that popularized dispensationalist interpretations of Scripture. His work made dispensationalism accessible to a broader audience, particularly in the United States. 3. Lewis Sperry Chafer, 1871 to 1952, a student of C.I. Scofield, co-founder of Dallas Theological Seminary in 1924, which became a significant center for dispensationalist teaching, authored Systematic Theology, a comprehensive work that outlined dispensationalist doctrine. 4. Charles C. Ryrie, 1925 to 2016, an influential theologian and professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, known for his book Dispensationalism Today and the Ryrie Study Bible. His works aimed to clarify and defend dispensationalist theology against criticism. 5. John F. Walvoord, 1910 to 2002, a prominent theologian and president of Dallas Theological Seminary, wrote extensively on eschatology and dispensationalism, including books like The Rapture Question and the Millennial Kingdom, played a key role in shaping contemporary dispensationalist thought. 6. Hal Lindsey, B. 1929, an evangelical writer and speaker, best known for his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, 1970, which interpreted current events in light of dispensationalist prophecy. His work brought dispensationalism to a popular audience and linked it with contemporary geopolitical events. These figures have significantly shaped the development and spread of dispensationalist theology, particularly within evangelical Christianity. Their writings, teachings, and institutions continue to influence many Christians' views on biblical prophecy and the end times.
Oh no. Oh no.
Rigid literalism, as it pertains to dispensationalism, refers to the strict interpretation of biblical texts, particularly prophetic passages, as conveying exact concrete meanings rather than symbolic or allegorical ones. This approach has several implications and is a point of significant debate among theologians and biblical scholars. Characteristics of rigid literalism. 1. Literal fulfillment of prophecy. Interpretation. Dispensationalists often interpret prophecies in the Bible, especially those related to the end times, as events that will occur exactly as described. Dispensationalism is a theological framework within Christian eschatology that divides history into distinct periods, or dispensations, in which God interacts with humanity in different ways. It is particularly popular among evangelical Christians and has significantly influenced their views on biblical prophecy and the end times. Here are the key features of dispensationalism. 1. 7 dispensations. Classical dispensationalism typically outlines 7 distinct periods in biblical history. Innocence, before the fall of Adam and Eve. Conscience, from the fall to the flood. Human government, from Noah to Abraham. Promise, from Abraham to Moses. Law, from Moses to Christ. Support for dispensationalism. 1. Biblical literalism. Adherence. Many supporters of dispensationalism appreciate its commitment to a literal interpretation of the Bible. They believe this approach provides a clear and straightforward understanding of Scripture. Reason. This literal interpretation is particularly appealing in interpreting prophetic texts as it offers specific predictions and a timeline for future events. 2. Distinctive plans for Israel and the Church. Adherence. Dispensationalists value the clear distinction made between God's dealings with Israel and the Church. Reason. This distinction helps them understand the role of Israel in prophecy and the unfolding of God's plans across different dispensations. 3. Focus on prophecy. Adherence. The emphasis on end times prophecy and the detailed timeline provided by dispensationalism resonate with many evangelicals. Reason. This focus offers a structured and hopeful perspective on future events, including the return of Christ and the establishment of his millennial kingdom. 4. Practical influence. Adherence. Dispensationalism has had a significant impact on Christian education, particularly through institutions like Dallas Theological Seminary. Reason. Its systematic approach to theology has shaped many pastors and theologians, influencing evangelical thought and teaching. Criticism of dispensationalism. 1. Rigid literalism. Critics. Many theologians argue that dispensationalism's strict literalism can lead to misunderstandings of biblical texts. Reason. They believe that some passages are meant to be interpreted symbolically or allegorically rather than literally. 2. Division between Israel and the Church. Critics. Some Christians, particularly those from Reformed and covenantal traditions, criticize the sharp division dispensationalism makes between Israel and the Church. Reason. They argue that the Bible presents a unified people of God, encompassing both Jews and Gentiles, especially in the New Testament. 3. Eschatological focus. Critics. The heavy focus on end times prophecy can sometimes lead to speculative interpretations and an unhealthy preoccupation with predicting future events. Reason. Critics argue that this can distract from the broader message of the gospel and the ethical teachings of Jesus. 4. Political implications. Critics. Dispensationalism's support for modern Israel, based on theological grounds, has been criticized for influencing political agendas, particularly in the Middle East. Reason. Critics worry that this support can contribute to political instability and conflict, and may neglect the rights and needs of Palestinians. 5. Historical validity. Critics. Some scholars question the historical basis of dispensationalism, noting that it is a relatively recent development in the history of Christian theology. Reason. They argue that earlier Christian theologians and church traditions did not hold to a dispensational framework, suggesting it may not be a faithful representation of biblical teaching. Conclusion. Dispensationalism has both strong supporters and vocal critics. Its emphasis on literal interpretation, clear distinctions between Israel and the Church, and detailed eschatological timeline provide a coherent theological framework for many evangelicals. However, its rigid literalism, division of God's people, preoccupation with prophecy, and political ramifications raise significant concerns among other Christians. Understanding these perspectives helps in comprehending the broader landscape of contemporary Christian theology.
Oh my Lord.
Rigid literalism, as it pertains to dispensationalism, refers to the strict interpretation of biblical texts, particularly prophetic passages, as conveying exact concrete meanings rather than symbolic or allegorical ones. This approach has several implications and is a point of significant debate among theologians and biblical scholars. Characteristics of rigid literalism. 1. Literal fulfillment of prophecy. Interpretation. Dispensationalists often interpret prophecies in the Bible, especially those related to the end times, as events that will occur exactly as described. Example: predictions about the return of Jews to Israel, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and specific events during the tribulation period are expected to happen precisely as outlined in Scripture. 2. Clear historical periods. Dispensations. History is divided into distinct periods where God deals with humanity in different ways. Each dispensation is understood as a literal phase with specific characteristics and divine expectations. Example: the grace dispensation is seen as a literal period of time that began with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and will end with the rapture. 3. Literal interpretation of texts. Scripture reading. Dispensationalists read biblical texts, including highly symbolic books like Revelation and Daniel, as literal descriptions of future events. Example: the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the millennium, in Revelation 20 is understood as a literal 1,000-year period. Implications of rigid literalism. 1. Predictive prophecy, expectation. There is a strong focus on predicting future events based on the literal fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Consequence: this can lead to specific and sometimes speculative interpretations of contemporary events as fulfillments of prophecy. 2. Historical and political support for Israel. Theological basis. The belief in the literal fulfillment of biblical promises to Israel leads to strong support for the modern state of Israel. Political influence. This theological stance influences political attitudes and policies, especially among evangelical Christians in the United States. 3. Eschatological focus. End times. A significant portion of dispensationalist teaching is dedicated to understanding and preparing for the end times, based on a literal interpretation of prophecy. Outcome: this focus can sometimes overshadow other aspects of Christian teaching, such as social justice and ethical living. Criticisms of rigid literalism. 1. Misinterpretation of symbolic language. Critique. Critics argue that many biblical prophecies are intended to be symbolic or allegorical, not literal. Example: the beasts in Daniel and Revelation are often seen by non-dispensationalists as symbolic representations of empires or spiritual truths, rather than literal creatures. 2. Historical anachronism. Critique. Some scholars contend that applying a literal interpretation to ancient texts can lead to anachronistic understandings that do not account for the historical and cultural context of the original audience. Example: prophecies about the land of Israel might be understood differently when considering the historical situation of ancient Israel. 3. Narrow focus. Critique. The emphasis on literal fulfillment of prophecy can lead to a narrow theological focus that overlooks broader biblical themes, such as the ethical teachings of Jesus and the call to love and serve others. Example: the parables of Jesus, which often use symbolic language to convey moral and spiritual lessons, might be underemphasized in favor of prophetic texts. Conclusion: rigid literalism in dispensationalism underscores a commitment to interpreting the Bible in a straightforward and exact manner, particularly concerning prophecy and historical periods. While this approach provides clarity and specificity for many believers, it also faces significant criticisms regarding its interpretive methods and broader theological implications. Understanding both the strengths and limitations of this approach is crucial for a comprehensive study of dispensational theology. Dispensationalism has had a notable political influence, particularly in relation to support for the state of Israel and Middle Eastern policy. Here are some key aspects of this political influence. Political influence of dispensationalism. 1. Support for Israel. Theological basis. Dispensationalists believe that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, This belief is rooted in the idea that God's promises to Israel in the Old Testament are eternal and unchanging. Political actions. Many dispensationalists advocate for strong political and financial support for Israel. This includes lobbying efforts, supporting pro-Israel policies, and opposing actions perceived as harmful to Israel. 2. Influence on U.S. foreign policy. Evangelical lobby. Dispensationalist beliefs are widespread among evangelical Christians in the United States, a group that wields significant political influence. Policy impact. This influence has shaped U.S. foreign policy decisions, particularly those related to Israel and the broader Middle East. Examples include the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and the support for Israeli sovereignty over disputed territories. 3. Christian Zionism movement. Christian Zionism is a political and religious movement that derives from dispensationalism. It advocates for the return of Jews to Israel and the establishment of a Jewish state as a precursor to the second coming of Christ. Activities. Christian Zionists engage in various activities, including organizing trips to Israel, supporting Jewish immigration to Israel, and raising funds for Israeli projects. 4. Middle Eastern conflict. Conflict dynamics. The strong support for Israel, influenced by dispensationalist theology, can exacerbate tensions in the Middle East. This is particularly evident in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where dispensationalist support for Israel often aligns with political stances that disregard Palestinian claims and rights. Peacemaking challenges. Critics argue that dispensationalist political influence can hinder efforts toward a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by promoting a one-sided view that favors Israeli territorial and political objectives. Criticisms of political influence. 1. Ethical concerns, moral responsibility. Critics argue that dispensationalist political stances sometimes neglect the ethical implications of supporting policies that may lead to the suffering of Palestinians and other groups. Justice and peace. There is a concern that an unwavering support for Israel, motivated by theological beliefs, can undermine efforts for justice and peace in the region. 2. Theological misuse. Prophecy and politics. Some theologians and political analysts criticize the use of biblical prophecy to justify contemporary political actions. They argue that interpreting ancient texts as mandates for modern political policies can lead to misapplications and potentially harmful consequences. Reductionism. There is a concern that the dispensationalist focus on prophecy reduces complex geopolitical situations to a simplistic narrative, overlooking the nuanced realities of the region. 3. Geopolitical implications. Instability. The political actions inspired by dispensationalist beliefs can contribute to regional instability. For example, U.S. decisions influenced by dispensationalist lobbying, such as moving the embassy to Jerusalem, have been met with widespread international criticism and have sparked protests and violence. International relations. Dispensationalist-driven policies can strain relationships between the United States and other countries, particularly those in the Arab and Muslim world, who may view such policies as biased and unjust. Conclusion. The political influence of dispensationalism, particularly in the context of support for Israel, is significant and multifaceted. While it provides a theological foundation for strong support of Israel and shapes U.S. foreign policy, it also faces considerable criticism for its ethical implications, theological justifications, and geopolitical consequences. Understanding these dynamics is essential for comprehending the broader impact of dispensationalist thought on contemporary politics. A suitable title for a video covering the political influence of dispensationalism, particularly in relation to support for Israel, might be Dispensationalism and its impact on modern politics, theological foundations, and geopolitical consequences. This title highlights the key themes of the video, emphasizing both the theological basis and the practical political effects of dispensationalism.